Good morning. Just a quick check to make sure everyone can hear me. Maybe you can't.
We can.
We can. Okay, good.
Thank you. Thank you.
So, firstly, thank you very much for allowing me to speak at this technical symposium. It's been interesting to watch a selection of the speakers over the last couple of days, and I think when we get to the end of my lecture, you'll see that things are coming together with many of the same messages that I hope we can move forward with. I will move forward. So firstly, a little bit about myself. I think most of what's on there has just been read out verbatim. So I won't say too much more about that other than to say that presently I continue to lecture at the University of Portsmouth, which is not too far from Franco in London, also in crisis disaster management, so we're in similar areas. I think my emphasis tends to be more on response and the preparation for response, so exercising risk management, but we are in similar worlds. So I'll move on there. So today I'm going to talk about the SIMEX series and how that has gone through the last couple of years, as well as the evolution for the 10 years or so previously that we've been running this exercise, as well as several other exercises that this organisation arranges and delivers on an annual basis. So the SIMEX series itself started with the University of Portsmouth back in 2012. It is an exercise that was designed to meet the learning outcomes for the master's students of the Crisis and Disaster Management course, and it was aimed to give them an experience of mobilising as a humanitarian organisation or an organisation associated with humanitarian response to a large-scale disaster. It's evolved since then to involve many other organisations. Obviously, the last couple of years have been a bit quieter than previously, but in 2017, 2018 and 2019, we had exercises which involved in excess of 50 organisations, more than 30, sometimes 40 different countries were involved, and in between 2,000 and 3,500 people actually on the ground for the 3 days of the exercise that we ran. Clearly, the last couple of years, as I say, have been a bit quieter because of the COVID situation, but what that has done is allowed us to focus on how we can improve the delivery or evolve the delivery of exercises in the way that they're planned, in the way they're delivered, in the way that they are evaluated and then integrated into future objectives. And as you can see, some of the objectives and some of the aims that we have there include those goals. One of the lucky things that we are involved with is because of our links to several universities within the UK and throughout Europe and other parts of the world. We also look not just at the performance of those participants at the exercise, but also at the way in which the exercise is delivered and how we can learn some lessons moving forward with that. And that ties into the UN Simulations and Training Network, of which I'm a lead member, which is a network within the United Nations, which hopes to bring together exercise directors, those arranging and delivering exercises in a global community of practice, community of purpose, to share experiences, share knowledge, share failures, and move forward in the development of the provision of exercises and simulations. And I know that if you were online yesterday listening to Kenny Meesters or Thomas Peter from the UN, you may have heard the HNPW mentioned. The HNPW is the Humanitarian Network Partnership Week. Last year in 2021, it took place in May. Previous to that, it has normally taken place in February, and this year again, it will take place in May. It's a combination of online, remotely attended, and face-to-face attended activities, which will take place in Geneva. If you log on to GDAX or just do a search for HMPW, you will find out all the details you need to know for that. but the Simulations and Training Network certainly uses that facility to bring together those involved in exercising to share their experiences. As I say there, we used HMPW 2021 because it was completely online as a way of looking at and examining how exercises and simulations had been affected during the pandemic period. And as you'll see when we go through it, I think what actually happened is that this pandemic period acted as a catalyst to improvement of delivery and incorporation of novel techniques for exercising and for simulations. I think this would probably have happened anyway, but because of the pandemic, I think this was speeded up by necessity to maintain a level of activity that was needed to ensure that we could assess competence within organisations and maintain that needed practice of skills which exercising and simulations would normally provide, but were not able to during much of the periods where populations, including the emergency organisations, were restricted because of lockdown procedures across the world. So the UN STN, we challenged that network in a series of online meetings over the 3-week period of the 19th of April to the 7th of May 2021 to look at those 3 questions. So once the pandemic is no longer a restrictive issue, how would and what components would you keep from traditional exercising, if any or all, and what new approaches had been developed specifically during that period, but also when we looked at that, we wanted to look at what was being developed anyway and had been sped up by the need to look at this, but also completely new ways of incorporating different techniques and different emerging technologies into exercises and simulations. So the main context and discussion points that we looked at were what effects the global restrictions had on exercising, why there was a requirement to adapt. Some organisations said that they weren't feeling any requirement to adapt. Others said that they had been effectively brought to a standstill by the pandemic. So we wanted to understand across the wider picture how that balanced out for all organisations, what potential there was for change, and how that manifested itself in the short, medium, and long term, and whether or not those effects were permanent or they were just something that we were transitioning through during that period. We wanted to share the experiences. We wanted to look at those technologies that were available and were then used either as they were planned or in new and innovative ways to address the challenges that were being met, or whether there was new technologies being developed to address those challenges. We wanted to look at the gaps that were there. We wanted to look at the barriers that were there for the adoption of these new technologies and new ways of working. And we wanted to look also at what opportunities we'd had that could be used to act as a lever to continue to ensure that training, exercising, simulations were continued to make sure that competence was maintained throughout the emergency response organisations. We also specifically looked at the advantages of, there's a variety of names for this, but virtual reality, augmented reality, extended reality, whichever term you use for this, and they all mean slightly different things, but how they can be used. Again, it's one application of a particular avenue of emerging technology, which is quite rapidly developing within the emergency response world. We wanted to look at realism and whether realistic simulations can be too realistic. This is an area of research that I've been looking at for probably close to 8 years now. So some of these things predated the pandemic. These were things that we were thinking about in any case, but the pandemic kind of focused our minds as to how they were affecting emergency response populations. We wanted to look at other concepts gaming theory is practice gamification. How useful is that in exercise? Certainly, military organizations have been playing war games in apostrophes for many, many years. And it's an approach that is nothing new to them at all. And they've been getting more and more like some of the commercial gaming that you see on Xbox or PlayStation or a variety of other platforms that you can use. We wanted to see how that could come into the emergency response and the humanitarian response world. Some interesting responses from various sectors of the humanitarian response world in relation to that one. And we also wanted to look at where these new techniques just wouldn't do what you needed them to do, and where there was no way other than to eventually at some point get back to having people feet on the ground, talking face to face, practical physical exercising. Whether that would ever come back in its complete traditional way, or whether we were always going to be using some kind of evolved hybrid way as an approach for future exercises. Just very quickly, talk about the SIMEX series, SIMEX 21, our experience during SIMEX 21. Unfortunately, SIMEX 20 was cancelled altogether. That was SIMEX exercises take place in the UK, the south coast of the UK, and a variety of other locations notionally. SIMEX 2020 was cancelled altogether. We had no choice. We had a full exercise planned with many attendees, but that was just cancelled because of the lockdown period in the UK. SIMEX 21, the exercise environment that we built, because we had the ability to do some physical activities, but we knew that many organizations were still very cautious and still are very cautious about attending large-scale, face-to-face, physically attended events. So we built a completely notional environment, and you can see a map of it there. This is an island called Entopia, which, although you won't find it in the Southwest Atlantic, if you've got the right link for Google, it is there. We built an island, and this is one example of using online applications that had been around for some time to create environments. It went fairly well at SIMEX. SIMEX was our first full trial of the environment of Entopia. We've since used it for 6 other notional exercises, all with slightly different emphasis, all with slightly different exercise and learning objectives. And we are refining that. It is becoming better and better as we learn what does work, and just as importantly, what doesn't work. So one of the aims of the exercise is to constantly try different methods and different approaches in the delivery of the exercise. And I am as happy to try something that I think will not work as I am to try something that will work, because there's as much learning to be gained from getting it monumentally wrong as there is to getting it right. Exercise objectives. Obviously, we had the SIMEX series as an exercise. As I say, we've used that environment quite a lot for lots of different exercises that we've done recently. And then there's the participants that come. They have their own organizational exercise objectives. And the way that the SIMEX series has worked with all of its exercises since we started was, rather than setting a series of aims and objectives right from the start and imposing those on the participants that come to the exercise, we have our overriding aims, but they are very generic. So within that, when a participant or potential participant comes to an exercise, we ask them what they want to achieve. And then we build the objectives of the exercise around each of the organizations that come. And then out of that, we develop interagency objectives, and in some cases, additional exercise objectives. It takes a bit more work to build that, and it's much more conversation, but I think ultimately you end up with an exercise that meets the needs of the participants to a far greater degree. So 2021, as I said, was mostly remote attended exercises. It was based on Entopia, as I've just said, a large hurricane or slow moving hurricane, along with huge volcanic eruption causing associated earthquakes, which ultimately ended up in the destruction of a nearby island to Entopia and the huge effect on Entopia. We did this deliberately, and we pitched Entopia as a capable island, an island that was had good welfare systems, was able to take care of itself, so that there was no existing humanitarian presence on the island. That therefore required any attending international assistance to develop their own data sets, their own information, and build up the picture from zero, other than the history and the geological and geography of the island, but almost from zero to build up the history and the picture of the island in which they were attending. Things that are important when you're running these things is obviously exercise control. The little picture that you can see there, you can see 5 places that people work. Place 1 was me, that's where I sat. 2 was a guy called Dr. Michael Human, who is responsible primarily for the collation and evaluation of the organization. 3 was our social media guru. He sat there and did the Twitter thing and the Facebook thing and all the other bits and pieces that go on. 4 was our spare station that we could put people out if we needed to. And 5 was kind of the information hub. It's a large screen television with all the data that we're using at the present time that's going on through the exercise. What can become a little bit onerous and sometimes shows the need for further personnel resources. That's a picture of me, which I didn't realize was taken at the time it was taken. But as you can see there, I've got 5 screens working there, 3 different laptops and 2 external screens. There's 3 Teams meetings going on at the same time. And all of a sudden I ran out of screens. I needed another screen to find some information on. So I had my phone actually in my hand with an Excel document open on. So I had access to some data sets that were being mentioned in a particular meeting so that we could inject that information into the meeting. That's not a good thing. Clearly, we now identify a failure of allocating the correct resource or sufficient resources to the exercise. That really is a job that should have been done by 3 people, not 1 person. That's something that I hope I don't get wrong again. We did also have some physical attended activities. These were done with the students of the University of Portsmouth, those on their Masters of Crisis and Disaster Management. They involved role players and moulage and basically a day of a journey with the ultimate target of being able to assess a developing refugee IDP camp and all the problems and issues that they had to deal with getting to that point. And then ultimately when they got there, being in a situation where that camp would be in imminent danger of destruction and then having to leave that camp. And that went very well, much smaller than we've normally been running at SIMEX, but because of that, we were able to concentrate on it. We also had other activities taking place. We had information sessions. This was run by Sphere, a well-known humanitarian organization, sets many standards for many activities that take place during humanitarian response, and they have supported SIMEX series for the last 3 years and will do again this year in 2022. They ran an online informative input session, which always gets a good audience and is always very well received. And then the last thing as well, we also ran a discussion forum. 2 of these we broke at the exercise for a couple of hours on the 2nd and 3rd day to have one discussion on how exercising was evolving, very similar to some of the things I'm talking about today, and then another one the next day on behalf of the United Nations UNDAC team and the EU civil protection teams to talk about remote coordination following the disaster, which Kenny Meesters, actually, who was one of the speakers yesterday, he led that on behalf of UNDAC. And both of those discussion fora generated many discussion points with lots of extremely good ideas being put forward into the conversation. So you can see as an entire picture, there's a lot going on. Even though for 2021 there weren't that many people physically involved, we still had probably, well, I would have said 400 to 500 people involved in one way or another notionally on each of the 3 days that we were running it. Valuation, obviously, valuation is a vital part of any activity, certainly a vital part of any exercise. We like to make sure that this is done properly, and we evaluate how we evaluate every year, and we look at not just the way in which the participants perform, but also very much from the CIMEX series perspective, how the exercise performed, how we delivered it, what the experience was like for those that took part, and how it worked for those, and facilitated interagency working as well. We looked at a combination of remote and blended components. Some of that worked very well. The ability to have remote or notional types of exercise take place, and then all the decisions, all the situational awareness that comes out of that can then be bled into other activities. Some of those were notional, some of those were physical. Equally, some of the physical activities generated decisions and situational awareness that could then be blended into some of the subsequent notional activities. So that works very well, and we think that's certainly something that we will continue to do within the CIMEX series exercises for as long as we continue to run them. Timekeeping is absolutely vital in those things to ensure that you can control exercise flow in a way that allows you to use the results of one of those aspects in the other. But as long as you can get that right by a series of exercise conditionality, use of directing staff, various other conditions that you can put on the exercise, that's a really excellent way of hugely expanding the amount of information that can be involved in the exercise without needing people on the ground physically undertaking all the activities that would be required to generate that information. Obviously, we look at our own objectives, our own expectations, and they're evaluated every year. But equally, we look at the individuals, the organisations, the inter-organisational objectives, and reflect on how they've worked. I've mentioned the values of remote and virtual components. General feedback and comment is always welcome. It's something we promote hugely in all aspects of the exercise. And we also act to collate, where appropriate, the individual evaluation reports from each of the individual participants. Those are not made public unless the organisation agrees to that, but they also help us look at the interagency objectives and how they've been successful or not. The observer evaluator mechanism changed quite a bit this year because we had to have people observing remotely. We used Microsoft Teams for the majority of our meetings, and we had, I think, at 1.6 meetings going on simultaneously, and over the 3-day period we used Microsoft Teams on 42 different occasions for different types of meetings. Some of them only lasted 30 minutes. I think the longest one lasted just over 4 hours. So a significant amount of IT required, and someone needs to watch that. They need to be recorded so they can be reflected upon in future. You can go back and check what happened. So the IT is vital that you get the IT right. But there's also a huge number of other. We used Zoom for some of the information. Sphere used Zoom for their informative sessions. Some of the organisations had meetings themselves that they took. They arranged outside of the exercise platform. They used Zoom for that. They used Google for that. There were a few Skype conferences going on. So one of the important things that came out of that is there are a huge number of different ways of talking to each other and managing information, and the ability to be able to work or be familiar with it at the very least. Most of these is a vital part of actual emergency response, not just exercising for emergency response, but actually when you come to do it for real, you need to be familiar with these organizations. There are several exercises that have taken place, and they've taken place very successfully, but they have built their own platform for the exercise. And whilst that allows concentration on certain exercise objectives, which is absolutely vital in the cases of most of these exercises, it does detract from reality of emergency response, which is no doubt now a numerous number of various platforms for communication, information management, and arranging things such as logistics, etc. And they are all evolving at the same time, and there are new ones coming along on a regular basis. So the ability to have whatever you use in-house be interoperable with these external organizations or open source organizations is also something that should be strongly considered. Some of the learning that has come out of this, this list is a very high level list of the learning that we've identified during CIMEX 21 in not just for the, as I say, the participants, but also for the way in which we deliver the exercises. The slide after this will have a link which will take you, if you wish, to the actual report that was the headline report that was produced after the exercise, and I'll show you that in a second, but I'll give you a chance just to look through those. We found that exercises have got the ability, the opportunity to become a lot more inclusive and globally more accessible. Obviously, time is always an issue with the time differences around the world, but we can't do too much about that, unfortunately. But the ability to have online platforms hosting exercises allows you to involve pretty much anyone at any time, so long as they're willing to be online for the activities that are being undertaken. That in itself also increases the opportunities for interaction, exchanges of information, shared learning, the experiences, the competencies developed, and all the advantages that an individual and an individual organization would get from exercising. These can be shared much easier than they would have been able to otherwise. You can scale things at whatever size you wish, you can transfer things, you can now repeat the same thing again and again if you wish to, and you can compare those repetitions directly with one another, which is something that certainly has been possible, but much more difficult to achieve up to date. Exercising has always been, or one reason for exercising has always been a showcase of experience, a showcase of competencies. That continues, but also, if these are done properly, the ability to drive competence is there, and more importantly, if you've got competence, the ability to drive confidence in that competence is also there. And bizarrely, whilst we talk about globalization of exercises and the ability to reach a wider organization, there's also the opportunity to be much more localized, because much of this emerging technology is allowing much more comprehensive exercising and simulations, but at a much more local or individual level. So if you want to run an exercise just for your own individual organization, just look at some of the ways that this is being done for the bigger exercises and apply some of the same principles. They are there and they're allowing.
Mr. Crook, I'm sorry.
I'm very close to finishing. I'll speed up and go to the next one. I won't cover the rest of those. I won't cover the rest of those points, but I will just go to this page. That's the final report from the exercise series this year. There's a link there that if you go to that will allow you access to that report, and it will cover in a bit more detail some of the points that I mentioned there. I think that you're going to get copies of these documents anyway, and then that's my contact details if anybody wishes to contact me. That's me done. Thank you very much. I know I started a little bit late, but I think I finished just about on time. I'm happy to answer any questions if wished.